Okay, so to conclude, I'm going to think about some of the things I've been talking about youth and young people through some of the course concepts from earlier in the course. You remember back in the start, in I think weeks 1, 2, and 3, we introduced theoretical perspectives around functionalism, around conflict, and around symbolic interactionism. It's really important not to get too bogged down in kind of these things. Functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism aren't actually theories. They're traditions of theories. They're kind of different ways that different ways of sociology have developed, have different orientations to their object. That is, that functionalism tends to look at the ways that societies function, the way that they can be more efficient. Conflict theory tends to be ways of kind of problematizing what's going on and challenging the status quo. Symbolic interactionism and interesting in kind of the ways that everyday relations and situations reflect broader structural concerns. So when it comes to youth, we can consider that, and I'm just going to focus on the functionalist and conflict traditions here, that youth are seen as carriers of the future. So from this orientation, it's kind of that, children are the future, treat them well and, let them lead the way kind of thing that many of the moral panics are about. But from the functional point of view, I suppose, by, socializing young people in the right way, it means the future of society will work well. So they must be trained as the next next generation. Sometimes youth are rebellious in this sense. They're seen as threats to social order. So therefore they must be dealt with and kind of, made not to be rebellious and made to conform. So there's definitely kind of distinction made in the functional point of view between normal and deviant risk and how those things should be dealt with. Deviance, therefore, must be something to be controlled, re-socialized, and that kind of thing. So I'm talking here about kind of specific kind of youth orientations, youth research orientations. The conflict point of view, which is much more where youth studies comes in, youth are seen as a kind of the group that is kind of most dangerous, challenges hegemony, has their own way of life or that kind of thing. Most likely to take radical action, and that's not always the case either, but it's certainly kind of stereotype in a way. Youth are central to the process of social change. They see the world with new eyes. They bring, new technologies, new ways of life, new ideological capacities to bear on current problems or current ways of doing things. So they kind of challenge the social status quo in many ways, and therefore conflict perspectives see them as something to be, controlled to suit current ideology because current ideology suits, older people. So you can see two different orientations towards what, it means to be young and what how young should be treated in society through these two different sociological perspectives. In terms of youth culture and youth transitions, we can see it again, as I said earlier on, as a kind of key period, I suppose, of socialization. I think it somewhat maps on to that notion of secondary socialization. And this happens, as young people go through school to work and that kind of stuff, but also happens in youth cultures. And youth cultures are kind of, as Stephen Miles pointed out back in the late 90s, ways of both fitting in and sticking out. The work that Miles and his team did in a school was like asking young people, about their fashion, about their practices and all this kind of stuff. And there was kind of both a desire to fit in, but also like not to be a conformist. Young people often talk about how they're not conformists and, strongly deny this kind of idea that they conform to things. But then the research shows that, even in kind of resistive groups like punks or whatever, there's a kind of whole bunch of different things that you need to conform to. I mean, the subculture of goth, for instance, is a kind of way of, resisting dominant norms through, fashion or whatever, but, you've got to kind of wear black. So there's kind of this tension between fitting in and sticking out. So youth here is a key site of socialization. But, we can again think about this through some of the tensions and concepts that we've been looking at in the course. Our youth culture's sites, therefore, of pseudo-individuality. Is this where we learn to perform ourselves? Or, importantly, perform different versions of ourselves in different contexts, like Goffman talks about. Maybe, entering into a particular youth culture or youth subcultures where you can maybe be yourself more than the performance of self you might do in front of, your parents or your boss or your teacher or whatever. So youth cultures in this way are kind of sites of socialization, but we can problematize them and critically engage with them through these other kind of conceptual things we've been looking at in the course. In the last few weeks of the course, we've been looking at class, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. And certainly the original subcultural theorists in the Birmingham School in the 60s and 70s were particularly interested in class. They saw things like punk and mods and rockers as a way of working class people to rebel against kind of more middle class bourgeoisie kind of norms. But as Angela McRobbie pointed out, she was part of the Birmingham School back then, many of these studies tended to kind of not even include women as kind of things. They just weren't really there. Or they presented women as kind of support roles as the girlfriend, not as kind of active participants in their own right. So as McRobbie very quickly and really influentially pointed out, is that subcultural belonging expression, women were certainly part of it, but they often would do these things in the private sphere rather than the public sphere. So it relates to what I was saying earlier on about that kind of often orientation towards spectacular youth cultures that happen in public, punks with mohawks going to gigs or whatever, rather than maybe what was kind of happening in youth cultural practices in the home. Certainly masculinity and femininity are kind of key sites are socialised in youth cultures, and that's where they're kind of socialised and reproduced. But there are also ways of resisting and transforming those kind of norms as well and challenging them. Post-feminism is a good example in the ways that kind of generational, over generations, feminism changes. And we've seen kind of first, second, third, fourth, and maybe fifth waves of this kind of thing. As a new generation of young people come along, they challenge the earlier ways of doing this particular kind of politics. It results in different kinds of struggles and arguments about who does feminism correctly and what's needed today to, do the best emancipatory work for women. And in particular, this now has relations to what I'll talk about in a minute about race and ethnicity and the way the particularly kind of privileged white form of feminism seems to dominate the public airwaves. And if you're interested in aspects of that, look at the work of particularly Ros Gill and others around the idea of post-feminism. My favourite kind of gendered subculture is Riot Girl, and I'm showing my age here, kind of thing from the 90s that happened around grunge in many ways. Again, many of the grunge bands that kind of dominated 90s alternative kind of culture were mostly men, but there was, this Riot Girl thing going on as well. Challenges sexism in the underground music scene and promoted young women's independence. What's interesting quite often about subcultural practices that kind of challenge dominant understandings of capitalism or consumerism is that they're kind of subversive in that way. They kind of challenge capitalist ideals. But then what happens within those spaces often reproduces, sexism or racism. If you're interested in that kind of analysis, see the work that I've done with Megan Sharp in punk scenes about the way that kind of gender inequalities are reproduced in them. Riot Girl was kind of quite prominent. It has a kind of a really good legacy as well. So I've got a link to a documentary there, kind of historical documentary that, outlines its history and shows how important and how resistive to dominant norms it was. Okay. Of course, race, ethnicity is still the kind of key contour of inequality with all the things we're considering here as well. Certainly when it comes to youth transitions, in a country like Australia, young white people have an advantage over anyone else that's, not appearing white. There's been amazing studies done that have replicated CV studies in the US that show that if you send out a bunch of resumes that almost have exactly the same qualifications, but just change the names from Caucasian to maybe Middle Eastern to Italian. In terms of the responses, there's a sliding scale where the white name will get the most responses through to the Islamic name will get the least. In America, it was African-American sounding names got the least. So there's these hierarchies of ethnocentric kind of racism that happens in terms of that. Again, even with people with exactly the same qualifications. You can see here how elements of those kind of things would have a profound effects on the way that young people transition in that school to workspace in particular. So racism is really prominent in young people's lives, especially in public space as well. And you can see again how this would affect participation in things like youth cultures. Prominent example is kind of the Islamophobia around the Cronulla riots back in the mid to early 2000s, where much of the initial things leading up to that that riot itself were around like what's the right way to behave on the beach, and there was kind of clashes of like different practices that were meant to be allowed or not allowed on the beach. So again, there's lots of really interesting research done in Australia that's kind of uses that as an example. Certainly when it comes to youth cultures, there's a bunch of cultural appropriation and co-optation that goes on, and this has always been the case throughout the way that kind of pop culture works. I mean, the Rolling Stones were appropriating blues. So this kind of thing again happens throughout different cultures. You can certainly see this happen in terms of the way that there's this thing called hipster racism around fascism, where it seems to be like people will wear like native Indian headdress to a music festival or something and not really understand the offensiveness of kind of using those symbols. But while there's a kind of appropriation and co-optation, youth cultures are also genuinely a site of hybridity and remix culture and creativity where things are brought together. In terms of multiculturalism in Australia, Anita Harris and colleagues' work is really important here. Shows the way that kind of, while multiculturalism is kind of a policy and a way of thinking about the development of immigration and things like that, really for many young people, particularly second generation young people, it's a way of life now, more than a policy. Second generation youth especially must deal with living across difference. And again, you can think back to Goffman here about the different ways that, like, people that might speak a different language at home would have to perform a different version of themselves there, have different cultures and traditions to deal with, as opposed to when they go to school or go to a sporting fixture or go to the pub or whatever. So living across difference is an important way to think of the complexity of young people's youth transitions. And the last kind of concept I want to bring in here is risk society, that we spoke about in the week on globalisation mostly, and I think I also talked about it in talking about power and individualisation. The risk society theories and reflexive modernity around individualisation, detraditionalisation and reflexivity were particularly influential in early youth studies throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Those concepts are really useful for thinking about all those social changes that I was talking about in the youth transition section. Processes of individualisation, detraditionalisation, reflexivity, they can help us understand those kind of prolonged transitions, the elongation of education, the reliance on living at home more and more, and all that kind of thing. And the other kind of way of thinking about it is in the way that kind of young people and even children now are encouraged at ever earlier ages to start being responsible about their futures. There's less time to play. You've got to fill up your time with all these kind of productive activities to kind of fill up your resume. You kind of got to decide what you want to do in your life at an earlier age. Again, there's this kind of individualisation to be able to get yourself labour market ready earlier on that kind of, again, blames individual for widespread social, endemic, systematic problems. This is particularly the case when you kind of take into consideration the myth of meritocracy. The idea that if you just work hard enough and have the right amount of talent, you'll be able to do what you want. What a lot of the youth transition study shows here is that people are fed that from a really early age. It becomes something that people kind of believe in. But then, as you start experiencing this transition, you realise that it's not actually the case. And there's this real kind of disjunction between the promises that we're kind of sold as, from an early age through to our experience of those things. And people are kind of linking this stuff to kind of mental health issues, alienation, anomie, and those kind of concepts we looked at earlier in the course as well. So those kind of concepts around risk society and reflexive modernisation have been really useful in particularly the youth transitions research. Could have kind of, picked out all the concepts in the course to try and kind of use to help analyse young people's lives, but I'll leave that up to you to think about other ways of doing that. But I'm hoping that throughout the course we've instilled many different ways of thinking about these things and thinking about various social problems more broadly beyond young people that I'm talking about now, that can help you understand, the way the world works, how inequalities are kind of reproduced, and, hopefully how some of these can be addressed and how social change can happen. To very much conclude, I just want to point out some links for you. If you're interested in youth studies, we've got a centre here. Should have changed that. It's now the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre, not Network. So I've got some links to staff profiles of the researchers involved in that. We're all interested in different aspects of young people's lives, so please check that out. Also, if you're interested in this topic, there's a whole youth studies course that runs in semester 2 at a third year level. It's completely online and self-directed learning, but there's an array of topics there you can look at. I do the first couple of weeks, broad introductions to youth studies, and then go into some of the research that we're actually doing in the centre, and look at different aspects of young people's lives. So there's the kind of list of probable topics there. I might change it up a little bit, but I'll see how it goes. And lastly, again, relating to youth issues, but also more broadly around consumption and technology and stuff like that we've been looking at throughout the course. There's a course that runs in the winter break. It runs compressed. It's online only. It goes for 4 weeks over the winter break. So if you want to kind of get ahead, or you've got an elective to fill, it'll be or you're doing the sociology major, you can do this. It used to be a course that I just ran by myself called Consumption in Everyday Life, but I've now co-teaching it with Duncan, so we're doing consumption technology in everyday life. And you can see the list of topics there. So we'll be looking at stuff like, is algorithms and artificial intelligence going to, come and kill us in the end? And why is all the stuff we have so crap? And why is gentrification happening? And how does consumer culture relate to things like waste and inequality? And how do places themselves products and try and sell themselves and all this kind of thing. So if you're interested in some of the things on the screen there, you can think about doing that topic in the winter break. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.